Tom, please come again and please address us now. Thank you.
Yes, it's a real pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Bonn. I've been to Germany many times, but somehow missed this important opportunity. So I'm really glad to be here. And it was a great pleasure to work under Joachim's direction on the UN Food System Summit. Great opportunity for me. So I'll be talking about global to global analysis of land and water sustainability. And behind this is something called GlassNet. It's a 5-year NSF funded project. There's a website you can find. It's designed to build a network of networks. And one important part of this is to support early career researchers such as yourselves. I'm looking at the audience, much of the audience here, to move back and forth between the US and Europe in order to strengthen links between these international interdisciplinary networks. So I'll say a little more about that at the end. By way of motivation, we're all familiar with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And if you look at those, fully half of them somehow relate to land and water resources. So that's a motivation for us and the guide for this GlassNet effort. As we were preparing this project proposal and started thinking about what could we contribute, we felt like much of the research on sustainable development tends to fall into one of 3 traps. It's often very disciplinary. We wouldn't find that here at CEF. I've heard that the PhD students have to start out with interdisciplinary studies. That's excellent, and that's certainly the future, but that isn't the case in many institutions still. Another aspect that is that most of the sustainability research is really appropriately so local in nature. Why? Because the circumstances vary by locality. And to really understand sustainability, you need to understand the local conditions, whether it's the soils, the climate, the governance, many aspects of that. But if you ignore the global context, you can often end up going in the wrong direction. You need to also know which way the world is moving in order to do your local planning. So local work without the global context also is limited. And then the complex proprietary nature of much of the research, often now it's not proprietary, but no one really can replicate it because of the complexity. So we want to address all of 3 of these limitations in GlassNet. So let me say a little more about the global context. So we feel that while the sustainability issues are inherently local in nature, they're often driven by global forces. And that's why it's so important to know something about what climate scientists would call the boundary conditions facing local decision makers. So local sustainability challenges driven by global forces, but the solutions vary by locality. You need the global, you need the local. In this case, thinking about global drivers of local stresses. But when you think about this even a bit further, the local responses, if there are enough of those or pervasive enough, they can feed back to the global level. That's why we have this logic global to global. And I want to share with you some examples of that type of analysis, convince you that it's feasible, and perhaps convince some of the PhD students that this is an angle they might want to pursue in the future. So the outline of the talk is here. I'm picking a set of challenges that have this local characteristic to them, but are driven in many cases by global forces. So we'll talk first about groundwater sustainability, and inherently, a key element of that is irrigated agriculture. Then we'll turn to water quality challenges, and they're inherently local in nature as well. But again, we will see that if this is addressed on a national basis, it can feed back to the national and global levels. And then finally, I want to talk about something that is a bit of a digression from these earlier topics, but also has the global dimension, and that is climate change, in particular, human heat stress. we're just publishing a paper in Earth's Future on this topic, and I wanted to share with you some findings there. The focus there is in West Africa and human heat stress and how that translates into poverty. So to start with groundwater sustainability, and we'll start focusing on the US, where it's an area where we've done a lot of work lately. And if you think about, look at the US and you look at surface water stress and scarcity, it's really dominant in the US West. We're focusing particularly on groundwater. That's where we think the biggest sustainability challenges are. And the rationale for that, if you look at the hot red areas here, these are areas in the US, say Central Valley of California, Upper Snake River Basin, parts of the Ocala Basin. They are withdrawing 10 times the annual recharge rate. So you can just see that water level, that groundwater level declining. And you see these dramatic photographs of subsidence in the Central Valley. Here's a telephone pole. The land used to be up there. Now it's all the way down here. So it's a very serious problem in the Western US as well as elsewhere in the world. So we'll start out looking at the US and then we'll look at the global picture as well. So focusing first on, and just by way of further motivation, agriculture, of course, accounts for 70% of freshwater withdrawals, even higher if you're looking at water consumption. Groundwater accounts for 40% of these irrigation withdrawals in the US, and that's doubled as a share since the 1950s. People are going to groundwater. They're going to groundwater because that's something they have under their control. And as they face a drought, what can they do? They can't affect the irrigation system delivering the surface water, but they can drill deeper. This is also an area that's extremely distorted from an economic perspective. So when you think about water prices, often they're not really water markets, but you can see what the shadow price of water is. And in Tucson, Arizona, for example, it varies from $27 per acre foot in agriculture to $3,200 per acre foot in urban uses. So a tremendous misallocation of this resource from an economic perspective. So most of the water is used in agriculture. Its shadow price is much lower than elsewhere. And ultimately, and we're already seeing this, is with scarcity in the Western US, scarcity in the Colorado River Basin, they're taking it away from the Central Arizona project. And so we're interested in what will happen under these sustainability scenarios. Of course, demands for water are growing in other sectors. Irrigation agriculture is going to have to adjust. That's where the scarcity will be resolved ultimately. So let's focus on that. And I want to start out talking about this theme, global to local. What are the global drivers of regional groundwater stress? So here's an example. We're using a framework I'll talk about in a moment. The simple economic water, it's the simple model of sustainability. And it's simple because it's a simplified economic framework, just enough complexity to allow us to address these sustainability issues in an interdisciplinary context. So with this framework, we can quantify what are the drivers, first of all, what are the drivers of crop production and irrigation around the world? Well, it's population, it's income, and it's productivity. These are the key global drivers. And you can see the rates of growth in those drivers vary greatly across the world as we look forward to 2050. Of course, the population growth is going to be in sub-Saharan Africa, but a lot of the income growth will be in Asia. The green bar being the income growth, per capita income growth, the red bar being population. So we filter this through this economic modeling framework, and the version we're using is gridded. It's a framework that allows us to focus in on the US, highly resolved US, rest of the world aggregate, or the world on a grid. It's a flexible framework. So much like the GTAP framework Joachim alluded to earlier on, this is a flexible framework that can be adapted to the problem at hand. And so in this particular instance, we're going to be focusing on initially on the US crop production and irrigation on a grid cell. So The richness here comes through the representation of grid cell activity. We know for each grid cell, what is the groundwater supply elasticity? What is what does the surface water supply response look like? What about cropland supply? And what about key features like nitrate leaching that I'll get to later on in the water quality section? So within each grid cell, there are rain-fed and irrigated activities, and the characterization of those activities is based on detailed information from biophysical and models, whether hydrologists, agronomists, climate scientists, and so on. So we can put these things together and look at groundwater, regional changes in groundwater withdrawals. These are the drivers. More productivity means less groundwater withdrawal if you can do more with less, but more income growth means you want to produce more and you're pushing up production and groundwater withdrawals. We're going to hone in on the US here, just the one column related to the US, and take that apart. And we want to make a very important point here that would apply to many countries around the world, but it's a particularly important message for US policymakers now, and that is the key drivers of anything to do with US agriculture, and especially sustainability and especially groundwater in this case, are not developments in the US. They're developments elsewhere around the world. So in the population component here is the red. Look at US population. That's not a key driver. More important is population growth in Africa for groundwater sustainability in the US. If you're interested in sustainability, you need to be thinking about things in a global context. The same with income growth. We can look at this at a grid cell level. Income and population growth in the US, how much is that driven by, groundwater, groundwater withdrawals in the US, how much is that driven by US developments in population and income, and how much by the rest of the world? You can see that even when you go down to a grid cell level, the drivers of that, the drivers of those withdrawal, because through markets and prices and so on, in the rest of the world are more important than what happens in the US. You need a global framework to think about local sustainability stresses. That goes back to my earlier point, global to local. You need this global context. Of course, you also need to understand what the characteristics are in that particular aquifer, the producers, what they're producing, and so on. So this just makes the point, global demand drivers of local changes. So I want to talk now about local responses to sustainability scenarios. So we're seeing it in California, we're seeing it elsewhere, we're seeing it in Arizona now with the withdrawal of water from the Central Arizona project. That's surface water, but that's also relevant. What are the local responses to this sustainability scenario, to the withdrawal of groundwater from agriculture, from irrigation? And it turns out that depends importantly, not just on what happens in water, but what happens in labor markets. I want to connect this idea of sustainability, in this case, groundwater sustainability, what happens in the human system, what happens in socioeconomic system, and the functioning of labor markets. So that's this next little element of this talk. So the sustainability, success of sustainability, I'm going to make the argument, success of this sustainability policy to reduce groundwater withdrawals is going to depend importantly on how labor markets function. And the developments in labor markets, wages, employment, and so on, is going to depend on the conservation policy. So that's a local outcome depending on this conservation policy. This is the policy scenario. Deep cuts in groundwater withdrawals in those hot red areas. So we're making this connection to labor markets, which turns out to be very important. We know now that labor market functioning is critical. I'm jumping down a little bit here. As a trade economist who spent a lot of time analyzing trade policies in the US, trade policies in China and elsewhere, we often overlooked the functioning of labor markets, and much to our cost. There have been some recent, in the last decade, important work done in the US showing how the opening the globalization of many markets, in particular manufacturing, and particularly the entry of China into the global marketplace, the displacement of US manufacturing production in much of in key parts of the country, how that translated into very adverse labor market outcomes and depressed communities. So severe equity implications that in principle, there was money for labor market adjustments in the U.S. legislation, but it was never fully implemented, and we've seen these depressed communities. So I thought, well, we're starting to think about a different kind of policy, conservation policies. That needs to be on our radar screen. We need to take a lesson from this past experience. If we withdraw this groundwater from Central Valley of California, for example, what's going to happen to the workers and how will that affect the conservation outcome? So we're thinking about that here. Of course, the labor force is very diverse and its functioning depends on, is it family labor we're talking about, hired labor, migrant labor? Many US policies, as I say, have been built on the assumptions that workers will move. We want to explore that further, particularly in light of the fact that labor mobility in the US is decreasing. There's evidence that even for migrant workers, who you think of as the ultimate mobile resource, they're less and less interested in moving, and that's been documented. So less labor mobility, how does that interact here? So we have a paper under review right now exploring this issue and contrasting this specification with a conventional integrated assessment framework, which either largely ignores labor or assumes that it's freely mobile. So in economic terms, perfectly elastic. The workers come and go as they're needed, okay? So that's this top panel. We're looking at changes in production at the grid cell level, changes in wages, and changes in employment. The changes in wages, there's nothing there. It's white. That's the implication of this assumption that they just move freely across sectors and across geographically. So you implement this policy of conservation policy, groundwater conservation, and essentially labor adjusts, production adjusts, employment adjusts. What happens when you put in labor markets? And this is where we've been collaborating with labor economists to characterize these. All of a sudden, there's a deep reduction in wages, okay? Employment doesn't change as much. The people don't all move out of the Central Valley. Some stay there. They try to make a go of it. As a result, you may not be as successful as you thought in the conservation policy, and there's severe equity implications. So the point is that conservation policy can have important local equity implications, but to explore that, we need to be thinking locally, and we need to be thinking in terms of labor markets. This wage map here is broken out into commuting zones. That's if people are going to stay in the Central Valley, that's the area in which they can feasibly commute. So you need to bring this to bear in the analysis. Okay, I want to talk to local to global feedback here in this case. If you implement the sustainability policy, of course, we know that a huge portion of the US and even the world production occurs in California, especially fruits, vegetables, nuts. What happens if you reduce that? Well, that production is prices will go up, okay? But people still want to eat those products. We're being guided really towards more fruits, vegetables, and nuts in our diets. So when you do that, okay, people want to consume it, it moves somewhere else. Where does it move? Well, it moves some to, there's something called the fruitful rim in the US. So it moves maybe down to Florida, but it also moves overseas. And so this is something that my colleague Iman Hagigi has investigated. And he's looked at how land use will increase even in the US, okay? Why? Because the yields are so high in that region where you're irrigating with groundwater. You move it to lower yield regions, land use goes up in the US, but it also goes up elsewhere around the world. So there are stresses, there are spillovers, and we need to factor that in. So this policy, we've learned that this policy, we need to think about it more generally. We can't just leave it to the hydrologists. The economists and sociologists and political science need to get involved to understand the functioning locally of this community, as well as the trade economists to understand how this will impact other regions. I want to drop back now and think about this at global scale. At global scale, we can now take the same framework I outlined earlier on and not just break up the US into 75,000 grid cells, but to break up the world into 1.5 million grid cells, okay? And and again, team up with the hydrologists in this case. We're collaborating with hydrologists at the University of New Hampshire, work very closely with them to characterize unsustainable groundwater use on a global basis. So this is the global picture of unsustainable groundwater use. And we want to tackle this in a hypothetical experiment where we do the same thing, but globally. So now, rather than shifting this production just over from the US elsewhere, it's going to have to move in a different way. And we want to explore that. So this is the global picture of unsustainability groundwater use. And of course, Northern India, very strong, Northern China. China, of course, they're having this south to north water transfer to try to overcome some of that. But you can see around the world, there's a lot of unsustainable groundwater use. So what's going to be the response? Well, you can engage in something agronomists call deficit irrigation. You just don't give the plant everything it needs. You pull back a little bit on the irrigation, yields fall, but maybe hopefully not too much. Irrigation technology improvements, you can shift from, say, flood irrigation to sprinkler and maybe even to drip irrigation. You can alter the crop mix. Of course, that depends what people want to buy. And you can reduce irrigated area, relocate production. So we want to explore those avenues of adaptation. So here's the story in terms of irrigated and rain-fed production. You get a decline in irrigation in those hot spots, an increase in irrigated agriculture elsewhere, okay? You get also an increase in rain-fed production. So that's one type of adjustment, adaptation we can map on a global level. The striking thing in this paper is forthcoming next month in a special issue dedicated to Tony Allen. Those people who know what virtual water trade is may have read the seminal work of Tony Allen coining the term virtual water trade. And he passed away. There's a special issue in his honor. This is part of that special issue. And for this, Iman and I had teamed up with a longtime colleague, Chris Perry, a longtime colleague of Tony Allen, to look at this sustainability question. So it was very interesting to do that. Chris Perry spent his lifetime working on water. He was deputy director of IMI, the International Water Management Institute. And we got we agreed on all the model, the parameters, the scenario, got down to the final results, and he was stunned, okay? He was stunned because despite these very strong local effects, both in production, employment, and other things, so some local communities really getting hit hard, at the end of the day, we showed this total result of a very small global impact on reduced crop production. And he was shocked. He said, that can't be right. So we spent the rest of the paper, our time on the paper, trying to explain to him why this came about and why it was a robust finding. So he was thinking of the orange on the left, okay? This accounts for 6% of global production, but it's twice as productive as the average. So it's 12% reduction in crop production worldwide. So you'd think that's going to have a big impact on prices. But then there's this possibility of substituting surface water for groundwater, substituting labor for water, managing it more intensively, capital for water, upgrading your irrigation technology, and other things at the farm level. Then there's the possibility of expanding rain-fed production. Then there's the possibility of relocating production within the country. And then there's the possibility of trade. And all of those margins of adaptation are what account for this difference at the global level. So we're not saying the local communities aren't hard hit, but at the global level, we were asserting this is not going to starve the world. This is not something Joachim has to worry about when he's talking about global food security. He needs to worry about the workers at the local level, but not global food security. So maybe a surprise to Joachim, I don't know. So Chris started attacking this. He said, I don't believe your substitutions. So we took away the substitutions, okay? What the on-farm adaptations. Well, the others grew and the gray didn't change very much. You trade more. You attack any one of these and the other adaptations enlarge. So this proved to be a pretty robust conclusion. Okay, that's groundwater sustainability at the national level, local level, national level, global level. Let's talk about water quality for a minute. I know that's a big issue in Germany. I know it's a big issue in Europe. It's a huge issue in the US. And the problem is that we use an awful lot of nitrogen fertilizer, phosphorus as well. I'm only going to be talking about nitrogen here. So the Corn Belt in particular, where I happen to live, is, corn relies heavily on additional nitrogen being added either through, say, anhydrous fertilizer or manure, and a lot of that runs off. We are particularly vulnerable in the Midwest of the US because Northern Indiana, the state where I'm living, used to be a beautiful wetland and a lot of wildlife, a lot of birds and whatnot. In the early 1900s, they came in and said, we could farm this. And they put in tile drainage just below the surface, a few feet below. So too much water, just drain it off into the stream. Well, now you apply that nitrogen fertilizer, it runs off, the excess runs off right into there, very efficiently transmitted into the stream in the Gulf of Mexico. And we have this dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So it's a big problem. The hypoxia task force from the Environmental Protection Agency suggested a 45% reduction in nitrogen load. So huge reduction in fertilizer use potentially. It's only getting worse. All the attempts the US government has put in place, just ineffective. How are we going to get there? So we wanted to explore this. And we wanted to explore it across different strategies and importantly at a multi-scale level. So there are many, many studies at the farm level, at the watershed level, even more broadly, but they don't take into account this local to local effect. So I want to highlight why this approach is particularly useful in that context. And we're going to look at taxes, economists' favorite instrument. We're going to look at nutrient management, the farm sector's favorite instrument. The 4 R's, we're just going to do that and everything's going to be better. Controlled drainage and wetlands. Controlled drainage means you put in this thing you're seeing the picture of, this tower at the edge of the field, and it keeps the water in there in the winter when you don't need to get into the field and when there's a lot of runoff occurring. The spring you need to get in, it drops the water level down and then it brings it up again. So controlled drainage and wetlands. This is the favored option and we thought that looked very good. The experimental farm right off of the Purdue campus showed that you could, if you put a wetland there at the edge of the field where all of that water's running off, denitrification might take care of 40%, 45% of that runoff. And so potentially a nice natural solution. The framework we're using is the one I talked about earlier, the simple G framework, but it's tailored especially to this problem and to leverage the expertise and knowledge of Chris Kucharik here, the head of agronomy at the University of Wisconsin. He's an agroecologist there and he's developed an agroecological model, AgroIBIS, that is very refined in its analysis of the Corn Belt. I mean, he accounts for maybe a dozen different soil layers, but very important in tracking out these leaching curves. And also mapping the yield response, which of course varies on weather. So this curve, these curves in the middle, we didn't actually try to interact with that model. It's very complex. It's run on an hourly basis and so on. But rather, we asked Chris to help us elicit these curves here. So for every grid cell and every practice, there are these two curves. Okay, as you increase nitrogen, what happens to leaching? As you increase nitrogen, what happens to yield? And you can see there's this very, very different curvature of these two. And at the high levels of N, where we are in the Corn Belt, it looks a lot like you could reduce N, not suffer a lot of yield penalty, and really cut the leaching. So we wanted to see, what happens when you tackle that. And you start to reel that in, which you can do with a tax. So It's using this simple G framework where we've embedded this knowledge from Agribus at each grid cell. So we've looked at these policies across the Corn Belt, and we've done it in this local to global framework. So we're accounting for changes in production, what happens to production and prices and everything else. And the interesting thing we identified here is that policy A is the tax, okay? So that kind of cuts leaching, okay? The blue is leaching, the reduction in leaching. Blue is good. The tax does a pretty good job across the Corn Belt. The improved nitrogen use efficiency does a good job across the Corn Belt. But let's go into some of these targeted policies, C and D, that only tackle the areas where there's subsurface drainage. There you see, you take land out of production in Indiana, that raises the price of corn, lowers the price of nitrogen. There's spillover effects. So elsewhere, they increase their applications and increase nitrogen and nitrogen leaching. So that was an important conclusion here. We also looked at what strategy would be best at each location. So that just highlights the value of this kind of local analysis, that these policies are local policies. What you can do in a grid cell depends on a lot of things that are specific to the grid cell. You could tailor the policies to those. And here we've just put them together individually and then together to see how close we could get to this overall reduction. What are the impacts on output and prices? And also we find this finding that really 50% of the problem is coming from 10% of the grid cells. But again, if you only hit those, they're going to be spillover effects. So this idea of combining a policy that hits across the whole Corn Belt with one that's targeted is appealing. I want to wrap up. Joachim was insistent that I not take too long so we could have some discussion. And I want to talk about something that it's okay, out of water, the water space and into the climate impact space. And this is I was telling Joachim when we were talking before, I only really became aware of this issue when a course I teach every spring, an interdisciplinary course on sustainability. I have students from across campus, so much like this institute, lots of different backgrounds coming together, and it makes it very interesting, very rich discussion. And I was talking about the usual crop-driven agricultural impacts of climate change, coming fresh off of the IPC, the last IPCC round. All of these, I had access to all of these crop impacts that were submitted to the IPCC. We'd done a meta-analysis. We were all over the crop impacts of climate change. And he raised his hand and said, I'm working on the impact of climate, of heat, humidity, and other factors on people. What about the people? What about the human impact? And well, it took us about 4 or 5 years, but we published a paper comparing these two, and we found that in places like sub-Saharan Africa, the human heat stress was more important, West Africa in particular, more important than the impacts on crops in terms of GDP or aggregate impacts. So that really got my attention. We continued to pursue this, and the paper coming out in Earth's Future, maybe this week or next, is thinking about human heat stress. So let me tell you a little about human heat stress so that you don't make the mistake I made, namely just focusing on the crops, and the IPCC was making really previously. And so what's the problem? Well, you're active. In this case, there's someone jogging, but you could be a farmer working in the field in the humid tropics. And they're working hard, so they're generating a lot of internal heat, and they're experiencing high temperatures, humid conditions, so your sweating is not as effective at cooling you down. They're under the sun, solar radiation, and this is a formula for serious heat stress, okay? And it looks a lot like farming and construction in the tropics. So we decided to tackle this question, and we didn't just look at agriculture, we looked across the whole economy. Now, how did we do it? The way climate scientists and physical scientists tackle this is they have something called the wet bulb globe temperature. And there's this instrument that when subjected to temperature, solar radiation, humidity, and so on, measures the temperature that matters for human heat stress. So it's not just, as we know, oh, it was really hot, but it was dry, so I was okay. But it's when it's really hot and humid together, that's a problem. Of course, we couldn't put this instrument everywhere in the world where we want to measure this. And we didn't put it there historically, and we don't have it there for the future. So we need something else, and that's this equation. So these guys down below, my collaborators at Purdue, have developed this very sophisticated, based on a formula of Lilligren from 2008. They've been able to, with new parallel computing and everything, they can compute this on an hourly basis, going back to the beginning of the climate ensemble, going forward to 2100. And so at every point around the world, for a given climate model outcome, they can assess what's the wet bulb globe temperature. And then we put that together with a labor impact function, which varies according to how hard you're working. And we can have, for different labor types, for different sectors, for different activities, across the economy, we can estimate what the heat stress is going to be, the human heat stress is going to be. And the approach we took, now there comes the difficult part. How does the person respond? Do they keep working and experience severe health problems for the rest of their life? That's another round of complexities. So we decided instead to say, what if they adhered to the ISO standards? So that means they can't work the full hour. They've got to rest. They can't work in the middle of the day. So we take that part of the labor force away. So each person can supply less labor. They're working in agriculture, they can supply less. And we factor in, okay, they could work a little earlier in the morning, later, whatever, but basically, you can't work in the middle of the night in a field without light. So to assess this, we reach back to my earlier life, the Global Trade Analysis Project, GTAP, which develops a database and a trade modeling framework that's continually updated and allows us for the assessment across the whole economy. Because I said construction is also important. And if agriculture needs more workers, where are they going to get them? And how are those sectors being affected? It's an economy-wide question. So it's also going to be important, the trade linkages, because we're going to focus on West Africa, but this is affecting the whole world. You can't just do this shock in West Africa and forget about the rest of the world. Are they going to be able to import their food? How expensive is that going to be? What are they going to export? So you need the trade linkages too. And we're bringing in household micro simulations. So this is from my experience 2 sabbaticals ago, where I worked on trade and poverty at the World Bank and developed a micro simulation approach to go with GTAP. So we're exploiting all of that here. So when we do this calculation, we run this formula across the world. And now, rather than saying it's 2050 or 2100, we just say it's 2 degrees Celsius warming from the end of the last century. So 2 degrees warming, this is 3 degrees warming. What does it look like? Because the different climate models hit that level at a different point. So the climate models look very different if you say we're looking at 2050. But if you start saying we're going to look at 3 degrees warming, all of a sudden they look a lot more similar. And we're going to run this across all the climate ensemble available for CMIC 6, the latest climate results. By controlling for the temperature instead of the date, they agree more closely and we can get more sensible, more robust results out of it. So we do this across the whole economy, across the whole world, and ask what are just the physical labor capacity losses. So no economics, just what does this combination of this wet bulb globe temperature, the labor responses, factoring in this across the whole economy, what type of labor is used in different sectors, how intensively do they have to work, are they indoors or outdoors, and we come up with these labor capacity losses across the globe. So you can see it's actually most severe in Pakistan and the labor capacity losses, but now translate that into GDP. So GDP impacts depend on how important the sector is. So labor capacity loss may be large in agriculture, but if agriculture is a small part of the economy, GDP effect is not so great. This is, again, no economic calculations per se here other than accounting to add it up to GDP. And now you can see West Africa be coming out a bit more strongly. West Africa is coming out strongly because these affected sectors are more important in that economy. That's going to matter for a lot of things as we see later on. So what are the poverty impacts in West Africa? So we do this calculation, we actually run the economic model, and what we get out of the economic model that's important for poverty is what happens to wages, because for the poor, they don't have a lot of capital. They may not even own a lot of land. What happens to the different types of wage income, that's what matters. And their wage income may be tied to agriculture, in case returns in agriculture are particularly important, or non-agriculture. So all of that is factored in here. What happens to wages and food prices in particular? All the prices of all the things they buy, but food prices are very important for the poor. They may spend up to 2/3 of their income on food. If food prices double, well, something has to change, something has to give, they have to consume less. So what happens to food prices relative to what they're earning? Obviously, higher food prices can even be beneficial for the people in agriculture who own resources in agriculture. So it's a complex story, and we look at 7 different strata, and these 7 strata were defined in such a way that we could map from GTAP to the household survey data and back. So agricultural dependent households, non-agricultural self-employed households, urban labor, rural labor, and so on. And you can see that the thing that really jumps out at you is that, Nigeria is hardest hit. And that's a big concern because Nigeria, we've just seen the population projections coming out anew from the UN, looking at a lot of people in the future. And we're looking at potentially a big poverty increase, 9% increase in absolute $2 a day poverty. And you can see it depends on where you are in the economy. In agriculture, the people who are self-employed in agriculture, they benefit a bit from the higher food prices. But the non-agricultural households and the labor households are hard hit. So poverty impacts potentially pretty big, potentially extreme in Nigeria, where food prices go up very, very strongly. So that's the end of the story on that. I'm happy to talk about it a little more. A little GlassNet, just a reiteration. This is a network of networks. Here are the networks you see involved in that. There's a workshop coming up. We have these regularly. This one is focused on land use, land cover change for integrated assessment in the Amazon. And this is our organizational structure, something someone like Joachim would be interested in. We've got a stakeholder advisory board, project leadership, and a science committee from across all of these communities. So I'm going to leave it at that. I think I stayed to 40 minutes, Joachim, so good. Yeah,
Tom, thank you so much. This was so TRA6, so CEF, interdisciplinary sustainability complexities, local, global, local, actually also past and present. Your story on the impacts on the poor due to heat stress relate to our history of greenhouse gas emissions in Europe, the US, and now China. So this is an issue of ethics and responsibility, which comes to mind. I'm sure there will be questions in the room or elsewhere. You colleagues are following the chat room. Please, colleagues on Zoom, feel free to chat your question in. You will be noted. Colleagues in the room, please address our distinguished speaker, Tom Hertel, with your questions or comments. Please go ahead. If there is slowness in raising hands, Tom, where do the substitution elasticities come from on the groundwater story? How were they created, these large substitution effects?
Ah, it's green. That's good. Okay, yes. I was highlighting, we had this tension with Chris Perry about these substitutional elasticities. Where do they come from? Well, our goal is to have, for each parameter in the model, to have a source that is from the literature and tied to, ideally, to the biophysical sciences. So to give you an example of how we get these substitutional elasticities, I showed you that Gompertz curve, which showed how, I'm going to go back to that for a minute, how yields respond to nitrogen fertilizer. That's a great example where I can show you, oops, sorry. I need to jump around too much. So the green curve here is called a Gompertz curve by agronomists, and it shows yield response to nitrogen. It turns out this can be mapped to the elasticity of substitution between nitrogen and land. Okay, it corresponds to that substitutional elasticity in the model. So how do we get it from agro-IBIS into our model? I'll do an example on irrigation in a moment, but this is particularly convenient. So it turns out there's a formula that relates the slope, curvature, and position on that curve to the elasticity of substitution. Kind of makes sense. If you're in a flat part, it's one kind of response, and another, it's another kind of response. So what we do is, for each of these green curves, which we have at each grid cell, we calculate that substitutional elasticity and put it in the model. Similarly, I hope that's not me. Sorry about the bing. Similarly, for irrigation, okay, how can deficit irrigation is really a question of how you can substitute land for water. Okay, we use a little more land, a little less water, yields go down, but we still produce something. And we do it in the same way. We ask the agronomist to vary the irrigation level, the irrigation intensity per hectare, and then look at the curve and bring it in. So that's the trick we're using. We haven't done it for all the substitutional elasticities, but that's our strategy, and we're trying to do it for the important ones. Thanks.
Thank you. When you speak into the microphone, say your name, because we are recorded. I'm probably currently not heard from here. Carlos, please.
Carlos City. Tom, I really enjoyed the presentation. I think I didn't understand something on your different ABCD approaches to controlling. If you put up that slide, you have the intersection of the three A, B, and C. No, go back to the results. Slide. Yeah. Why would adding additional policies to the tax make the result worse? It's bluer down there at ABC, ABD.
Oh, okay.
I would have expected that you fine tune even more. You apply the tax and you apply some of the other approaches. You should have less of a problem.
This is the color scheme problem. I'm sorry. It's tricky. So blue, deeper blue means deeper cuts and this is tons per pixel, change of leaching tons per pixel. So the bottom one is a reduction of 150 tons per pixel. And so deeper blue indeed means a better outcome.
Okay.
And yeah, it's confusing. Okay. What I was kind of trying to highlight, the red, you can see it popping up there around the edges. That's the spillover effect. You do something really good in Indiana, but in Missouri, something, there's an offsetting effect. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that, though. Thanks for clarifying. This is an important figure. So, yeah.
Anyone in the chat?
Yes, there are questions in the chat. Of course, the audience is very happy with the talk and thanks you for the presentation. There are technical questions and more overall question. I start with a technical one, which is here. What is the time frame of this model? How far is it in the forward looking in the future? And how does it account for shifting patterns in trade, for instance?
Right. Great question. So this model was originally developed in the non-gridded version when I was working with climate scientists, and they weren't even interested in looking at this until I could run it over history for a comparable period and show that it had some validity. That's always what they do as climate scientists. They run it over this historical period. So at the time, we were projecting from, say, 2010 to 2050. So we ran it backwards 40 years or 45 years. And really, the most important paper we wrote out of that revealed that, well, first of all, it did pretty well at a global level. The more refined you get, and certainly at a grid cell level, there's still lots of limitations. But the interesting thing about that is we uncovered perhaps the source of a lot of these over predictions of land use change going into the future. Because we looked back at the actual data, and there wasn't that much cropland expansion, net cropland expansion over that 40 years, despite the tripling of crop production. And we found when we started taking away certain economic mechanisms, it grew. And that helped us explain why some of these models that didn't incorporate economic adaptations were projecting so much land use change to 2050, even though population was lower. So that's kind of the global, the time frame we've validated over is typically decadal, multiple decades. We're not talking year on year. We're talking long run. That's the way it's been set up. There's some attempts to try to use it short run, but this is long run. And then on the trade side, we've used trade elasticities from the literature, and it's kind of influenced by the GTAP experience. So kind of trade elasticities in the GTAP world. Yeah.
Let's switch between virtual and room, please.
Hello, I'm Charlie Palmer. Is that working? Just a quick one about this ABCD. So from what you're saying, this is basically if you were to aggregate all of the impacts from these policies, if they were implemented in those places at more or less the same time, you would again get the aggregate impact to reduce this problem in the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. But I just want to ask, I mean, the model obviously tells you something important about policy effectiveness at a local level to have that national impact. But isn't the problem as always is trying to convince the states or whoever at the local level to actually implement a particular policy in a particular place? Because I mean, in some places they may prefer not to be taxed and to have a wetland instead, or the other way around. So isn't that always the issue? Is that we have the most elegant model with the perfect solution?
I agree entirely. That was kind of my point, that this problem has been around a while. And if anything, that 45% reduction in end loading they're talking about has increased in more recent studies, say in science. So it has proven to be an intractable problem. These solutions have not been implemented. And the tax is a non-starter in the US. I don't know how that is in Europe. The nutrient management they're all in on, but it doesn't really make that much of a difference. It's kind of the magic wand type of thing. The wetlands, despite the fact that farmers have been offered a lot of money, they're very reluctant to their grandfather's father drained this land, and damned if I'm going to flood it again. It's been very difficult, which is why we're just finishing a paper right now arguing that one of the big co-benefits of climate policy may be to address this problem, because it does raise the price of nitrogen fertilizer dramatically, because that depends entirely on natural gas prices. So maybe backdoor we could have some impact, but you're exactly right. This problem has been lingering because these policies have not been adopted, not been widely adopted. But this was exploratory just to show that you could look at location-specific policies in this framework. It's not, we don't have illusions that it's going to be adopted.
Yeah, we have a question here by Alisha Misabayev, interim professor here at the faculty, asking whether these models consider locally specific transaction costs. And maybe another question which is similar, to look at the assumptions in the different countries, by Monika Hartmann, also from the faculty, on the model with heat stress, the impact of heat stress. whether it considers that potentially mechanization of agriculture in many countries of the South could reduce the labor impact.
Right.
So maybe you could.
Yes, let me address both of those questions. So the transactions cost question, in some sense, I see that as, I'm going back to the labor one for a minute. I see that as surfacing here in, I mean, one important transaction cost is the cost of moving, okay? There's psychological cost, there's a physical cost, you know, and a pecuniary cost. So I think I view this labor market work as one attempt to get at a very important transaction cost associated with these conservation policies that has been overlooked. Obviously, there are many types of transaction costs, but this is a really important one. And you can see top to bottom in this figure, what a difference it makes to factor them in. So I think they are important, I agree, and they vary locally and whatnot. On Monica's question of heat stress and, heat stress and mechanization, yes. That is, it turns out that is factored into our analysis. That's a great question. And all of the tough reviewers surfaced that question right away. And so it turns out this GTAP framework, we've looked at historical potential when wages go up. And there are a lot of reasons why wages go up over time. And cost of labor goes up. That's been the main incentive to mechanize. Labor becomes more expensive mechanized. So that's been studied historically. So in a way, this is just another instance of labor becoming more expensive. So that's built into the model through these substitution parameters, elasticity of substitution between labor and capital. So there is that adaptation implicit here. It's in the model. There is mechanization going on, but it just can't happen fast enough and strong enough to overcome this effect.
Geographers like to think about what you do here quantitatively in terms of telecoupling.
Yeah.
And you basically now provide them with a tool to study telecouplings, right? I'm just wondering, what's the next level of this? So if you find out that there are places in the world that if they introduce some sort of policies, they affect other places more than others, then you could probably expand the concept of competitive advantages towards a multidimensional concept, which is not just costs, but also, you know, impacts on all sorts of environmental dimensions. If that's then possible, don't you think that that these models could also be used to sort of find out how countries should collaborate in terms of defining their policies such that the overall impact on a number of these indicators is minimized or maximized depending on what you want for each indicator. Sort of in terms of a global governance advice, yeah? We started talking about that yesterday, but we never finished the discussion. So I just wanted to try to link to that here. And I think the tool is perfect for this.
Thanks, Jan. You've raised a number of interesting questions, and you know we're keen to collaborate on these in the future. Now that this framework's kind of in place, we're also offering short courses to train people on how to use this framework, and we're working on a book. We're keen on getting other people to use it. But this is, yeah, you can see from this example, if the US goes it alone, they export a lot of the problem elsewhere. And so it turns out that I'm on a NSF project with Jack Liu, one of the big proponents of telecoupling, and he's very keen on drawing out some of this. And we have a version of this model where we've got high resolution in Brazil, high resolution in China, high resolution in the US. The idea is if something bad happens in Brazil or good, how does that affect the others? And so we're starting to think about playing that out. But just you're exactly right. There are telecoupling implications here. It's a good vehicle for looking at telecoupling, and in particular, looking at it now in the context of sometimes very local developments and how those might spill over. So yeah, great comment. And I say, yes, yes, yes.
Thank you very much for this inspiring talk. I'm Henning Hinsche here from the faculty. I have a question about the drivers of groundwater sustainability that you mentioned in the very early part of the talk. And you showed that these drivers can come from different regions globally. And yeah, this one. And of course, I think it's obvious that there might be drivers, factors from foreign regions, different regions. But I was surprised to see that foreign influences drivers or actually have a larger impact than the local impact, the US impact, and even particularly, if I see that correctly, specific areas, single areas of the world have a larger impact than US drivers. Can you comment on that? Why that is? What are these drivers? What consequences can be called?
Great question. And this is exactly why we developed this pinwheel thing, especially for if you were a senator in the US, we'd be, or a minister, we'd be particularly targeting you. Take a look at this, this figure here, okay? These are the drivers. Take a look at the red bar in the US, population growth to 2050. Take a look at the red bar in sub-Saharan Africa. It's just so much greater. And those people, you know, and then the additional people, of course, as their incomes go up in the US, they're largely satiated. They aren't going to buy a lot more food. But in Africa, not only is the red bar high, but the green bar is high. This is an optimistic projection. So this means a lot more food consumption, and it gets transmitted through the trade, through the global markets to the US. Now, we aren't assuming perfect world markets or one price. No. There's a geography of trade in here, but nonetheless, sub-Saharan Africa then becomes a very important piece of the pinwheel, and it looks as large or larger than the US, even though that population growth in the US is occurring in the US. And it's because of the magnitude of that red bar. And there's also the interaction with income. Yeah.
Fortunately, we need to slowly wrap it up. You gave us a lot of guidance for research at CEF. We are typically local to local to local. And the eye-opening linkages from local, global, local, which you offer to us, should give many of us in our science programs a pause. We need to strengthen our global framing. That's difficult in doctoral research. You need larger teams. So it was very impressive to see the diverse teams which you had with whom you are working on these issues, but we should try. Also, a thought is, as the food system contributes maybe a third to greenhouse gas emissions, there are macro feedback effects to the heat stress coming from the very food system whose prices are jumping up. So endless complexities, you will address them. You will have to come back. Thank you very much.